Once more onto the breach, dear friends. The Ukraine offensive was launched on Sunday, June 4th, 2023, on at least 4 sectors at the same time. This is a massive effort to breach Russian defensives along over a 1,000-kilometer-long front line. Ukraine aims to retake their territory and drive a wedge between Russia's land bridge in the south. But was this an overly ambitious and unrealistic goal to begin with? Well, if you're rooting for Russia, your view of the offensive so far is likely that Ukrainian forces have assaulted and slammed into an impenetrable Russian wall. You'll point to Russian figures that Ukraine has reportedly lost 7,000 soldiers KIA, 160 tanks and 360 armored vehicles were destroyed, including viral videos of charred, fancy Western vehicles. If you're rooting for Ukraine, on the other hand, you likely believe the full counteroffensive has yet to begin, and only a fourth of the 9 to 12 assault brigades have even been committed to the fight. You probably think this movement will take time and look less like a sweeping victory and more like a creeping one. I'm going to parse through the frontline reports. We're going to try to look past the fog of war here. We're going to try to look past the propaganda on both sides to see if we can get a better sense of what's really happening here. Because what hangs in the balance, what's at stake right now, is the future of the war and the future of Eastern Europe. We'll look at unclassified NATO documents that I found that detail Western breaching theory and tactics and doctrine to see what kind of hints it might give us as to how the offensive is progressing so far. I want to share with you this video footage I found of a Ukrainian soldier who's assigned to one of these assault units. He's one of the people that's being asked to go into the breach. He's a combat medic named Maksym. Maksym's 18 years old, and here we see him saying goodbye to his girlfriend and his family before heading off to join the fight, not knowing if he's ever going to see them again.
As a medic, at the call of the heart, there is a war in Ukraine. I don't want to sit at home. I want to help the guys there.
For a soldier, this is the most difficult moment right here before you get on the bus to deploy. You'll see family members cry that you've never seen show any kind of emotion before. This is when the reality of what you're about to do really sets in for the first time. As a young 18-year-old soldier about to deploy, you feel invincible because you're surrounded by millions of dollars worth of armored vehicles and thousands of dollars worth of kit specifically dedicated to you. You've trained for months straight just to do one single thing, so you feel confident. Your squad leader or your platoon leader has likely already been to the front lines multiple times and you trust them. Really, there's more of a fear of letting your buddies down than there is fear for yourself. But it can be uncomfortable for us to look at this footage released by the Russian Ministry of Defense, where we see a young Russian soldier who's been mobilized. He says something to the effect of he's just doing his duty to his country, but under very different circumstances. I used an auto-translation to get a rough idea of what he said, but it's, quote, "We took an oath that the homeland must be protected from them. Our people need help, but as they say, we don't leave our own behind." These two young men who, under different conditions, may have been friends, but these are exactly the kind of thoughts that soldiers need to push aside when asked to do the unthinkable. We often forget the human side of these major ground operations as we root for one side or the other, but as much as we'd like to think that it's the best military plans and strategy that guarantee victory, we've seen the outcome also depends on the actions and decisions of these young men, probably more than we want to admit. One of the most important directions of assault that we should focus on is from Zaporizhzhia, where the viral video of destroyed Western tanks occurred. Here we can see Vasilivska represents the westernmost town on this part of Russia's defensive line, which extends all the way to this city here. Russian artillery positions are located about 30 kilometers in the rear. Residents have described this city's location as an hourglass, the most narrow point through which each single grain of sand must pass. It's a tiny choke point through which you need to pass in order to get south. It's important to note there's a major Russian command and control center located here, and this is one of the only routes south to cut off the land bridge to Melitopol. The natural geographic water obstacle on its flank makes it ideal for defense, and this is why we're seeing Ukrainian forces trying to go around it first instead of going straight through it. And there's evidence of this from their capture of this city right here directly to the east. It is important to point out that this water obstacle to the west here was completely drained and is now what appears to be just a dry landmass. But if you're wondering if Russia or Ukraine could use it as a new avenue of approach to drive massive mechanized brigades through, It appears like that would be very unlikely. At least at this point, it doesn't seem like the ground is dry enough or hard enough to support many tons of armored vehicles. Although that doesn't mean that it doesn't open up other opportunities for maybe soldiers to move on foot. Ukrainian assaults have had very limited success, advancing about 2 kilometers in each direction. This map shows a good representation of the roads Ukrainian forces are probing. As of today, it appears Ukrainian forces have been unable to reach the proper first line of Russia's defensives. This could be an effort that takes weeks, which could feel slow if you're expecting another fast move like the last offensive. What we're seeing at this level is Russia's reinforcing each direction of attack. They're trying to judge where the main effort will be, while at the same time Ukrainian forces are trying to judge where Russia's defenses are the weakest and where they should deploy their full combat power. Meanwhile, Russia launched hundreds of cruise missiles in an attempt to destroy the offensive stockpiles of food and munitions that are located in the rear. Earlier this week, the cities of Odessa and Kryvyi were hit by missile strikes trying to destroy these ammo depots that the offensive depends on. Ukraine isn't in the business of doing battle damage reports for the Russian military, so they're not revealing if those strikes were successful or not. At the same time, a major dam was destroyed in Kherson, with both Russia and Ukraine claiming the other side did it to gain a tactical advantage here. This has effectively made an assault by Ukraine from this direction impossible. CSIS analysis outlines the defensive systems by Russia here. The Russian second subsystem stretches more than 130 kilometers from the town here to just north of here. This is where Russian units are prepared to fall back to and launch attacks from if need be. Zooming in along this front line, we can look at how the actual Ukrainian ground assaults have progressed. Video and photos of destroyed Western armor from this region went viral almost immediately after the offensive began. Russian media outlets were suddenly, for the first time in a long time, excited to share footage of destroyed armor. This battle has been geolocated to south of the city of Orihivki. More specifically, according to the Russian Warrior DV Telegram channel, the Ukrainian armored vehicles were damaged during an attempt to break through the defensive lines in the town of Malaya Takamacha. So why have a few destroyed vehicles come to visually represent this entire offensive? After months of articles and hyped up reports about high-tech, sophisticated, and extremely expensive NATO armor being sent to Ukraine, people were surprised to wake up to images of these highly touted machines in a smoldering wreck. One video that got a lot of attention showed Ukrainian soldiers evacuating from a damaged M2 Bradley. One of the Brads was spray painted with the letters NAFO, N-A-F-O. NAFO is an internet meme. It's kind of a troll associated with countering Russian propaganda. It's been called a kind of informational warfare, and you'll see NAFO members on Twitter in the form of a Shiba Inu dog in Western military kit often. While savvy internet users immediately recognized the joke spray painted on the Bradley, some people outside the know thought it was odd to see characters almost representing NATO on a Ukrainian tank. So I think there are a few things possibly going on with this viral cluster of a battle here. First, Ukraine isn't releasing any videos and photos of their successes, and they're on kind of a media blackout right now, so we're getting a picture that's sort of skewed in Russia's favor. That's the case whether Russia is truly doing an outstanding job on the ground or not. Secondly, Ukraine is up against a major air vulnerability that we're going to get into. And third, there is the possibility that Ukraine has not committed all assault brigades at the start of the offensive on June 4th. But evidence of this engagement shows it was likely only a few companies of soldiers that attempted to push forward here. I find it questionable that Ukraine is actually holding an ace up its sleeve and has chosen to not send most of their units in yet, but it's certainly possible. Nonetheless, the perception right now is that Ukraine's entire offensive was this video, which has been played from several angles to look like multiple different battles. So, was this a full-on breach attempt or a probe attack, or maybe it was something called a proofing operation? Because according to NATO breach theory and doctrine, if you look at page 10, proofing operations are when you send a small element forward to find proof that the lane has no mines. This is done before a major assault takes place, so this could be evidence in Ukraine's favor. Some landmines are actually resistant to mine-clearing explosives. It looks like the Bradleys might have been part of a recon proofing operation that ran into landmines that damaged them and they tried to retreat out of there. The virality of this single battle shows us just how much war has changed, where mistakes in combat are now digitally preserved forever and used by both sides' governments as tools to advance their version of events. There are also reports that 18 out of 109 US-made infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed, damaged, or abandoned over just the past couple of days alone. 5 out of the 85 Leopard tanks have suffered the same fate. That works out to about 15% of the total number of Bradleys sent. I think those numbers would have raised less eyebrows if they translated to an actual breakthrough in the Russian defensive lines anywhere along the front. On the other hand, that number, 18 destroyed Bradleys knocked out, actually suggests that Kyiv maybe did commit all of their Western-equipped units to the fight, and that the counteroffensive has been going slower than we expected. This is because it's unlikely that they had a 100% loss rate. It's more likely that they sent all of the Bradleys in and they suffered a 15% loss rate. This is, of course, wild speculation on my part, but it's just a possible hint and a theory to look at. And this tracks with reports that at least 7 infantry brigades took part in the first waves of the attacks. I should point out this information conflicts with other reports that only a few battalions assaulted. However, along this direction of the advance, Ukraine claims to have taken out 4,600 Russian soldiers, although, like the Russian estimates, these are likely exaggerated also. Russian sources claim they've repelled all assaults, and 3,700 to 7,000 Ukrainian soldiers were KIA in the offensive so far. This isn't 100% accurate, as Ukraine has been confirmed to have liberated 8 towns in the first week alone and made incremental gains of about 113 square kilometers. We can compare that to the 600 square kilometers Russia was able to secure during the entire winter offensive of theirs. When we look at Russian sources like TASS, they state that 30 to 40% of Western military equipment provided to Ukraine has been destroyed. Some of this is just plain exaggeration, and some of it is likely because Russia has destroyed a number of decoy tanks and counted those as actual losses. They could also be referring to maybe ammunition depots that they claim to have destroyed. Who knows how they crunch their numbers. We've heard reports over the past few months that Russian artillery shelling has slowed down, which has now taken on a new meaning in hindsight. Prigozhin even claimed he wasn't getting the shells he needed to advance in Bakhmut. It now appears that the rationing of these munitions by Russia was to save ammo to stop this offensive. Zooming in even further, when we look at the actual tactics that were used during the withdrawal of some of these Bradleys, it was not ideal in some circumstances. 2 Ukrainian Bradleys were retreating, crossing directly in front of a 3rd Bradley that was firing, laying down suppressive fire, and they nearly struck their own friendly unit. In the chaos of combat, this can be difficult to avoid. You're weighing decisions like prioritizing getting out of the kill zone, out of the ambush, with worrying about crossing in front of your own troops' fire. It's not an easy decision to make, and it's easy for me to sit here and second guess it and say they shouldn't have done that. But this was not a great example of how to break contact and fall back while under fire. However, it appears like the Ukrainian Bradleys here might have been trying to recover the vehicles and help their fellow soldiers escape, and that's why all the vehicles ended up getting bunched up within a few meters of each other, because typically when you're in a convoy or advancing on objective, you want your vehicles spaced out by at least 10 to 20 meters or more if terrain permits, to avoid making yourself an easy target. But we also see some impressive and mindful tactics, like troops on the ground deploying smoke grenades in front of the damaged Bradley. The footage appears to show that Ukrainian crews of the armored vehicles survived after the vehicles had deadlined. At this point, it's easier for the West to send brand new Bradleys, way easier than it is to retrain troops on combined arms, which takes far longer. It's important to note, oftentimes this same thing has been true for Russian losses, where we've seen Russian vehicles abandoned and their crews survived. So, what are NATO tactics for breaching defensive lines that these supposed 9 to 12 assault brigades have been trained on in the past 6 months? The declassified NATO breaching document puts it best. Breaching theory is perhaps the single most difficult combat task a force can encounter. NATO Offensive Combined Arms Breaching Theory has 3 different groups that need to act in perfect synchronization. It's been specifically designed by Western military experts to counter Russia's defensive depth doctrine, So understanding this theory will give us insight into whether or not we've seen actual attempts to conduct this kind of operation yet. The first group is the support group that's responsible for suppressing the enemy. Their whole job is to degrade the enemy's ability to accurately fire on the breach force. The support force does this by massing direct and indirect fire from tank platoons and calling for fire from artillery. The support force fires smoke to obscure the advance. They are located in the rear. The second group is called the breach force. This is made up of largely engineering assets and breaching tools like the US M58 Miklik provided to Ukraine. It's their job to create and clear multiple lanes for assault. The breaching group needs to destroy any Russian defensive obstacles like the 4-foot-high concrete dragon's teeth. They need to destroy minefields. They need to use the Western-provided M60 armored bridges and bulldozers to cross ditches. By the book, this breaching group has to clear at least 2 lanes, but more might be necessary. As soon as the breaching group fires the M58 Miklik mine-clearing device, the entire operation only has about 25 minutes to penetrate enemy defenses. Otherwise, the enemy will likely have enough time to redeploy and reinforce the area. The Miklik clears a route that's about 8 meters wide and 100 meters deep. When this NATO breaching theory was created in the late 1980s, they couldn't account for how modern drones would change these calculations. It's become exponentially more difficult to penetrate defensive lines because drones easily identify the location of breaching attempts, and they can bring artillery down to bear on them immediately. Another assumption is that your breaching forces will be backed up by air power, something Ukraine doesn't have a lot of. Moving on to the third group, this is the mobile assault company that drives through the hopefully reduced obstacles and penetrates deep into the enemy defenses all the way to what's called the far objective in the rear. It's their job to close with and destroy the enemy. This is where you'll pack your infantry fighting vehicles, your tanks, but they can only be as successful as the other previous 2 groups were. If they've done their job correctly and quickly, then the assault group has the best chance. This is why combined arms is so difficult, but I think the evidence suggests that this was not a full-on breach attempt, because we have yet to see large groups of armored forces like 2 or 3 brigades all concentrating and massing their forces in one single direction, which is what NATO breaching doctrine calls for. What we've seen in these Russian-released videos are a company of armored units. A brigade, for context, is 31 tanks, and a similar number of infantry fighting vehicles. Until we see assaults on that scale, we may have not yet seen the main thrust. But on the other hand, if you're looking at this from Russia's perspective, there's also plenty of evidence that does suggest this was a full-on breach attempt, due to the fact that Russian air power has been overwhelming during the offensive, which has forced Ukraine to split up their assaults into much smaller, company-sized movements to avoid masses of tanks becoming sitting ducks to air attacks. So what I'm saying is, we might never see a major brigade-sized advance in one location. I don't know, I'm just speculating on possible theories here. Ukraine has made limited progress in Bakhmut, where they reportedly advanced 700 meters on the flanks of the city. Analysts believe these attacks here are likely what's called a fixing attack. So this is meant to keep Russian forces in place and prevent them from redeploying elsewhere, although this remains to be seen in the future. Russian defensive military doctrine is actually a really smart plan in theory. It's based on defense in depth and maneuver warfare. We've seen they've adjusted their old school Soviet 1980s era defensive tactics to account for modern reconnaissance drones. Tataragami on Twitter noticed Russian defensive lines are more decentralized now. Instead of a straight line trench everywhere, they're positioned inside of tree lines and houses to avoid being spotted by drones. And I think this is part of the reason of what's slowing down this offensive so much, is because they've spread out their units before even the first line of trenches. So a battalion will be assigned to an area of operations in Russian unit. It's about 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers in size, and they're responsible for repelling any attacks in their area. What we've seen them do is deploy a frontline defensive row, and then 1 or 2 rear defensive lines to fall back to. The depth of these defenses will vary, but typically it goes back approximately 10 kilometers. DailyCost.com had a great article that did a good job of showing what Ukrainian forces are trying to breach right now. A series of vehicle obstacles, which can be ditches, barbed wire, anything that would make a tank have to stop and use engineers to breach. Then a land minefield, then dragon's teeth, which are these 4 feet high concrete blocks to impede armor movement, especially to prevent them from moving through open fields. Anytime vehicles need to stop to remove these obstacles, they make themselves a sitting duck for enemy artillery. And so where are we at this point after more than a week of assaults? The Institute for the Study of War reported signs that Ukrainian forces may be temporarily pausing counteroffensive operations to reevaluate their tactics for future operations. Now, pauses like this are a common feature of a major offensive undertaking, and this pause, they say, doesn't necessarily signify the end of Ukraine's counteroffensive. But if you're looking at this from Russia's point of view, you could make the case that this means Ukrainian forces got badly beaten and are now licking their wounds. To assure that this doesn't end the offensive push, the US Pentagon immediately announced they would send 24 additional Bradleys and Stryker replacements. The Biden administration announced in June 2023 that they'll provide an additional $325 million for air defenses, artillery, and anti-tank weapons. The Pentagon also put out a statement about how these are export models of the Bradley IFV, which were given by the United States, which gives the US some kind of wiggle room to say that this isn't the most up-to-date equipment that was destroyed, and that's why that happened. And that's on the top of a lot of people's minds right now. How could this equipment get knocked out so easily? One important capability missing from the export M2 Bradley models was explosive reactive armor, which could have helped against the anti-tank guided missiles that likely hit them. It's important to learn from these errors and not pretend that they didn't happen or ignore the losses. Honest, sober analysis in an after-action report about what went wrong is crucial to catching up to a steep learning curve. Of the limited videos I've seen from the Bradley, we've seen them using image intensification night vision devices, which are better than some of the tech that we've seen on some old Soviet-era Russian vehicles that require an active IR beam be shined out from an IR flashlight device. But this tech on the Bradley is still far short of the thermal cameras seen on American Bradley models. I don't know what exact optics capabilities that these Bradleys have, so I don't know if they have thermal imaging devices. But if they don't, it would be to their disadvantage. What we're seeing right now, though, for certain, is evidence that Western equipment, like all armor, is vulnerable without air superiority. The Warzone's Tyler Rajaway wrote a great analysis on this aspect that has been widely shared. The Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters' increased presence at this part of the front lines has highlighted the need for high mobility and survivable short-range air defenses. Russian forces have apparently adapted the way that they apply their air power after initial setbacks during their campaign. What we appear to be witnessing is they're using their attack helicopters in a less restricted way and are more willing to take more risks. They're flying closer to the front lines. This could be because the stakes are higher at this point and they can't afford to lose this territory. There's also a chance that Russia is testing the information that they gleaned from the leaked US Pentagon documents that had suggested that Ukrainian anti-air defense capabilities were depleted. They might have realized that this could be an opportunity for them to exploit that weakness with their attack helicopters. It could also be because, as Ukrainian ground forces attempt to breach forward, they're moving far enough forward that they're no longer under the protection of their air defense systems, exposing them to the enemy Ka-52. There's a gap in Ukraine's air defenses as they push forward. The Warzone points out that the Ka-52 has taken on the majority of close air support missions for Russian forces since the beginning of the war. 35 of them have been destroyed so far, though. Russia's estimated to have a total force of about 133 of them. New satellite images from the Russian-occupied airport in the southeastern Ukrainian city of Berdyansk reveal an influx of over 20 Russian attack helicopters that have been redeployed there from other locations. The reason this location was picked is because it's about 135 kilometers from the front line, which puts them just out of Ukrainian rocket and artillery range, well, far out, and the Ka-52 has a max flight range of 460 kilometers, which gives them just the amount of flight time that they need to get to the front, loiter for an hour or so, fire their missiles, and then return back to base before they run out of fuel. The Ka-52 has 6 wing-mounted hardpoints for launching air-to-ground missile attacks against armored units. It has a radar that can detect enemy ground units over 25 kilometers away. It fires the 9K-121 Vickers missile that has a distance of 8 kilometers. So what this means is that the helicopters have a standoff distance that's about the same as the Max Stinger missile range. Kalashnikov actually released video footage of this Vickers missile striking a Ukrainian M2 Bradley and destroying it. This missile is designed to destroy even explosive reactive armor with a penetration rating of 1,000 millimeters of steel. So these Russian helicopters are operating at the absolute extent of their max targeting and flying range, while also likely using the cover of darkness to avoid man-launched ground-based systems, like the Stinger missile. They're pushing these systems to their operational limits, and it's achieving some success for them. Even if Ukraine brought dozens of Stinger missiles with them, it's tough to engage low-flying helicopters at night. The thermal imager on the Ka-52 isn't perfect though. This pilot mistakenly thought they were engaging a German Leopard tank when in reality, it was an abandoned farming tractor vehicle. The attack helicopter's airbase is outside Ukraine's HIMARS and artillery range, although there is one way Ukraine could reach out and touch this base. In May, Britain announced they would send a long-range Storm Shadow missile as 190 miles or 305 kilometers by the official textbook numbers. These 2,900-pound missiles have already been fitted to Su-27 fighter jets and are striking targets deep behind Russian lines. This is still far shorter when you're talking about long-range capabilities than what Russia wields with their cruise missiles that have a range of over 2,000 kilometers. The Storm Shadow missiles are better suited for maybe different targets other than air bases. They're specifically designed to meet mission requirements for pre-planned attacks on high-valued fixed targets. The whole point of these missiles is to destroy ammo depots, command and control centers, and logistics chains, which is a major part of NATO doctrine for breaching operations theory. It's the first step you're supposed to take. So why doesn't Ukraine have the necessary air defense cover for their attacks? We know Ukraine has these systems. For instance, the US sent 20 of the Avenger systems, which is basically a Humvee with like 8 Stinger missiles connected to a sophisticated targeting computer. But the problem with these systems is that there's still a shortage. They're forced to protect civilian cities and key pieces of infrastructure against Russian kamikaze drone and missile attacks. The pre-existing Soviet anti-air systems are in limited numbers, and dozens have been confirmed to already have been destroyed in the war. When we look at the front lines, one of the most important things to understand is where Russia's ground lines of communications are located. Ground lines of communications refers to the route that supplies the combat unit to their resupply base. This is where food, artillery ammo, and the like is trucked through. In this instance where we're looking here, on the front lines in the east of Kharkiv, much of Russia's resupply comes from highways leading to Belgorod, and we'll see very shortly, Belgorod was invaded. These ground lines of communication gives us an idea of how far Ukrainian forces must advance in order to sever Russia's forces and their resupply routes. Throughout the front line, we can see these resupply routes are located about 30 kilometers to 60 kilometers distance from the front line. Practically speaking, this makes a lot of sense, right? That means that it's very close to where the artillery is probably positioned, and it's only about a 15-minute drive for one of the supply trucks to reach the absolute front line from the main highway. The reason this is important is because if Ukraine can reach this first highway, we know that this means Russian forces will have to fall back to at least this highway here, which is the next reasonable ground line of communication into Russia that runs parallel to the front lines. We saw this exact thing happen the last offensive. We often point out that the front line is over 1,000 kilometers long, and we rightfully assume that this is potentially a disadvantage for a defending force because they have to cover a massive amount of territory. But this frame of reference can be a little misleading because much of that front line is impassable terrain. There's rivers, forested areas, hills that you can't drive a column of armor through. This is why when we look at the open source intelligence map of the front lines, shows estimated concentration of Russian troop strength, we see their density of troops is highest near these choke points, and there are some regions that have barely any Russian soldiers at all, because there's impassable geographic terrain there. So Ukraine might be able to pick anywhere along the front line to attack, but in reality, there are much more limited to a few key roads that create tiny choke points along these front lines. But the counteroffensive is taking many forms, not just armored assaults. In late May 2023, a group of the Freedom of Russia Legion took control of several border settlements inside of Russia, in the Belgorod region, which is where a lot of these supplies come through. They were joined by the Polish Volunteer Corps. The goal of these attacks was likely to draw Russian troops away from other parts of the front line. It was to distract Russian forces prior to the counteroffensive taking place inside Ukraine. These Russian rebel factions are attempting to encourage full-on rebellion against the Russian government. This led to jokes about how they should hold an independence referendum in the Belgorod region. It appears like Russia lost control of these towns for only about 24 hours. The following day, in a Russian statement, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have defeated the insurgents and pushed them back to the Ukrainian border. Ukraine, for their part, have openly denied having any part in the attacks, and it's definitely in their interest to say they're not associated with these attacks. They have more to gain by saying they have nothing to do with it, and they have a lot to lose by claiming they were involved, because Russia could then use it as an excuse to escalate their attacks. Another major non-armored incident occurred 2 days after the Ukrainian offensive began, where on June 6th, a dam near Kherson was destroyed. It unleashed a flow of 18 cubic kilometers, or 4.3 cubic miles of water. This flooded farmland, cut power, and left 700,000 people without clean water. At least 52 people have died as a result so far. Now both sides are pointing the finger at one another, with no one really taking responsibility for the explosion. Russian sources like TASS claim without a doubt that Ukraine did this to distract from what they claim is an underwhelming counteroffensive. It looks like Russia's own units were flooded in the aftermath, which is used as evidence that this was done by Ukraine. Why would you flood your own units? In fact, the flooding destroyed many Russian first-line field fortifications that the Russian military intended to use to defend against Ukrainian attacks. Ukraine claims that Russia didn't anticipate how bad the flooding would actually be, and were only focused on preventing a Ukrainian assault from this direction, and that's how it happened. There was a clear concern in the Russian military information space that showed that there was a fear that this kind of crossing might happen, whether or not the fear is justified. It's possible troops from one side or the other acted on their own accord and were not ordered to do this. The other claim is Ukraine blew up the bridge to prevent it. I don't know exactly why this would be in Ukraine's favor to do this, though. I think the argument, if I understand it correctly, is that Ukraine destroys the dam and prevents water from reaching Russian-controlled Crimea and hurts Russia. The other case to be made is that it stops Russian assaults in this direction, but there really wasn't a threat of Russian forces advancing again near Kherson for the time being, if we're being honest. So I can't see how Ukraine doing this is in their best interest, but it's worth saying that that's what Russia claims. You could theoretically make an argument for why it benefits Russian forces to blow up the dam. They were in control of the area at the time, which means that they had the means to destroy it. By flooding the region, it has the benefit of restricting Ukrainian forces and preventing them from opening up and assaulting through Kherson if they plan to. Analysts claim this would take major explosive charges planted directly on the bridge, and since Russia controls the region, they would have the opportunity and means to do it. The offensive is still in its early stages right now. Whether that means we will see greater advances in the future, will we see Ukraine unleash these hidden assault brigades that they may have hidden away, or maybe it'll mean we've seen the culmination of their offensive already. This remains to be seen. If you like this video, I want to tell you about a new podcast that we're starting on the second channel called Two Bros, One Bunker. In it, my buddy Patrick Baker, he's a Marine, and we tackle different news and cultural issues, topics that don't necessarily fit in the main channel. We dive deeper into there. If you're looking for something to listen to on your commute and you want a more casual setting, then check it out if you're interested.